Now let's mix up a really bright, high intensity orange. We're just going to take the red and the yellow and mix those together. And I just want to show you a few things that this palette can do for you and do it very well. So here's a very intense color of orange that we've mixed up. Very simple. So let's see what happens. Let me add a little bit more. Let's see what happens when we want to gray this down. Well, to neutralize the intensity of a color like this, you just take its complement. Well, the complement of orange is blue because it's directly across on the color wheel. So let's just grab a little bit of blue, the ultramarine blue. It's the only blue we have on the palette, so that's our only choice. That's one good thing about this palette. And just by adding a little bit of this blue, you can see that we'll take the intensity of this orange down very quickly. And now we have a less intense orange. Of course, we've taken the value down a little bit also, so maybe I didn't need to add quite that much blue. But you can see that we can just keep adding more blue. Now it's going to go a little bit on the green side because our mixture that we made of our orange wasn't perfectly half and half of the yellow and the red. So this is too green now. Well, that's easy. To get rid of green, you use the complement, which is red. So basically I'm just trying to modify this mixture with one of the other two colors that I originally had, and I can get it back to that warmth of a really neutral dark orange. And basically we've kind of made a version of burnt sienna. So we've made our own burnt sienna. Well, you might say, why don't you just buy a tube? That's okay, you can do that. There are a lot of good painters that use burnt sienna. Mark English is one of them. The thing about this burnt sienna is it's made with these incredibly pure pigment cadmium colors. So there's a richness and there's a vibrancy and just a life to this color that a tube of ordinary burnt sienna doesn't have. Plus, you're learning the color wheel while you do this. So let's say we went too dull with our color. That's easy. We can just add our pure pigments back to this pile of this neutral orange that we have, and now we can start getting the intensity back. But compare this to where we started. So you can always get back to that original color, but it's interesting that this palette lets you have access to these amazing, beautiful, warm neutrals that you mix with these incredibly rich pigments, and they're just absolutely beautiful. They're almost jewel-like, and that's one of the reasons that I like using this particular limited palette. So we've looked at some warm mixtures. Now let's look at a rather cool mixture. Let's start with a blue, because a lot of students have trouble warming a blue mixture. So let's just start with our straight ultramarine blue, and as you can see, that's just really an intense color of blue. And what I want to do, let's say I have an image where this blue is way too cold, way too intense, and I want to take the intensity down, and I want to bring the temperature up a little bit because that's just too icy cold. Well, the easy thing to do is just to reach into this dark mixture that I have of our, what I call a homemade burnt sienna. And if I add that to this color, I immediately take the intensity down. And let me zoom in here a little bit more so maybe you can tell what's going on here. And if that doesn't do it, I can just take the cadmium red light and the cadmium yellow medium and add those. I'm just taking the warmest colors on my palette and mixing those with this blue. And hopefully on camera you can tell that this is still blue. That is still that's a big pile of blue, but it is much less intense. So let's maybe experiment a little bit. Let's put some white in it just so we can prove that it is in the blue family. And you can see that it's quite neutral, but it is blue, and it's a warm blue. It's not a really screaming intense blue. It's a very neutral, kind of a blue jean, kind of a denim color. And you might say, well, okay, well, I went too far. I didn't want it that dull. I didn't want it that gray. That's easy. With this palette, all you can do is grab the only blue you have, because you can't mix blue. You're stuck with what you've got. And you just mix blue back into it, and you can bring the intensity back up. So you're constantly balancing intensity and temperature, and of course everything on the palette looks a certain way, but nothing matters down here. It only matters up on your painting. It matters what is next to other things, how much of one color you have, how much of another color you have. So it's all basically just, it's a balancing act, and it's all relative. So now let's work with another cool color. Let's go back to our purple that we made. I'm just going to take ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson, and I'm going to add those together just to make a big batch of purple. Easy enough. Now let's see what happens when we warm this up. Let's take our warm colors again of alizarin, let's take our warm colors of cadmium red light and cadmium yellow medium, and let's get you in here a little bit closer so you can see what's going to happen here. So I'm just going to take this area of paint on my palette here, and I'm going to just keep adding the cad red and the cad yellow. It's a little bit too much yellow that time. So I started out with a big pile of dark purple. So now I'm just adding more of these beautiful rich cadmium colors. And you can see that the more pigment you add, that the intensity is coming up a little bit, the temperature is coming up a little bit, it's getting warmer, it's getting lighter, and these colors are just becoming absolutely jewel-like, and jewel-like, I should say, rather. And the key to that is the fact that these are cadmium colors. Cadmium colors are very expensive, and they're very thick with pigment, but they can do what no other paints can do. You can't do this with earth tones. So you just get this wide variety of these intensities, and they're just gorgeous. I'm trying to get this back toward the yellow side a little bit. There we go. So now you can see that we have this array of these rich, beautiful jewel-like colors, and we got there from something that was very dark and neutral, and you can just see this array of all these different warm neutrals, and we started with something very cool. So you can start here and go this way toward cools, or start on the cool neutral side and go toward the warmth and the intensity of the cadmiums. Another advantage of this palette is the fact that it's really hard to end up with something ugly and muddy. I mean, you really have to try to get to something that's not an attractive, beautiful color. And when I first started using this palette, I would just experiment every morning with different color combinations, just trying to figure out what different colors would do. So we've done orange and purple and blue, so let's do something in the green family. So here's just straight cadmium yellow medium and ultramarine blue, and we get just a really beautiful green. And of course, if I add more blue like this is the other beauty of mixing your own colors. If I add more blue, let me zoom in here a little bit so you can see, you get a cooler version of that green, and when I add more yellow, obviously it's going to warm that up as well. So now to neutralize that, I'll add just a little bit of the cadmium red light, and you can see that the intensity will go down right away, and you start getting these more neutral greens, and pretty soon it becomes a really deep, dark olive green. And you can do the same thing. You can add a little bit of alizarin, and then you have to add some blue back to it. And it's still in the green family, but it's a really, really dark, low intensity green. And as always, we can go the other direction as well. Now we went from a really rich, intense green, and we started making neutrals. And gosh, I sure hope you try this, because these neutrals are just so beautiful the way they're built up. And I know that they're not coming across that way on the camera as gorgeous as they really are. So let's try another green really quickly here, just to show you we can go the other direction. We'll just get a batch of green going here, and we can start adding some yellow, and I want to put a little bit more blue back in there. And now I am going to add some white, because I want to bring this intensity up. I want to make it lighter, and I don't necessarily want it to constantly go toward the yellow side. So again, I'm using the power and the physics of this white to kind of bleach out the intensity of this cadmium medium that I'm continually adding, so that I don't just end up with a yellow that looks a little green. I mean, I want a true light green, and I'm using the white to kind of bleach out that yellow so that I end up with a true green. I'll go one more step here. Every once in a while I wipe my brush on a paper towel to get some of the pigment out of it. So there we have an array of greens as well, starting with just the straight pigment of ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow medium, and then adding more cadmium yellow medium because I'm using that to lighten the mixture and to keep it bright and to keep it in the green family. And I'm using the white in this instance to kind of bleach out that yellow. And remember, I said that when I use blue, I think of it as a type, when I use white, I think of it as a type of blue. So the white and the cadmium yellow together were kind of mixing as a blue, and I just got lighter and lighter and lighter, adding cadmium yellow medium and white. So we started with one mixture of green over here that went from pure pigment getting darker and more neutral, and up here we went the other way. We started with very bright pure pigment and then went lighter and tried to keep it the same intensity. Through the years when working with this palette, I told you the concept that I had about inviting in a guest color to add some variety, and the most often used guest color I had was probably sap green. After that, burnt sienna. I used yellow ochre on occasion. Finally, burnt umber once in a while when I had a painting that was predominantly dark, and also cerulean blue. I think the first step to really understanding color and bringing it to the level that you can really work with it and understand it is working with a limited palette. Now, you don't have to use the exact palette that I just showed you, but try to figure out a palette that works for you with the way your mind works, the types of paintings that you do. The palette that I showed you is amazing, and it's versatile, and it's almost unlimited, but you can decide whether that palette is right for you, but just try to limit your choices. Other things you can do to help your color, and this is something you can do today, now, immediately, on the painting you're working with currently, or from the paintings that you've done in the past, or something that you'll start fresh. And that is immediately decide whether this painting should be warm or cool. Because if your painting is half and half, it's a huge problem. Your eye and your brain start to try to figure out, is it warm, is it cool? It seems like a very simple thing, but that makes a huge amount of difference. So make your painting either predominantly warm or cool. The next idea is to set up a color scheme that you can use from the beginning, and hopefully you can stick with that. You can alter it along the way, but usually it's a good idea to start with a color scheme and try to make it work. And obviously you want to pick a color scheme that makes sense for the image. One such color scheme would be the complementary color scheme. That's when you take two colors that are directly across from one another in the on the color wheel, like orange and blue or red and green, and you make, again, you have to immediately think of a dominance. I want this painting, I'm going to be using blue and orange, and I want 70% of it to be in the blue ranges of color, and maybe I'll have 30% of it in the oranges. You can have it 90% blue and just little accents of orange, but you need to complete that color wheel in your brain and in your eye so that you have the entire color wheel to make it a full color painting. Another color scheme I think is better than the complementary color scheme, because the complementary color scheme gets very harsh and acrid very quickly because you're using these diametrically opposed colors. So a way to soften that is what's called the split complementary color scheme. That's when you take a color like blue, and instead of going directly across to the orange, you split it right before it gets to the orange. So you end up using blue as the dominant color. We're just pretending at this point. And you have yellow orange and red orange instead of just that flat direct orange that's directly across from blue on the color wheel. So that softens that complementary color scheme quite a bit. Another color scheme would be an analogous color scheme, and that's when you take 3 or 4 colors that are adjacent to one another on the color wheel, and you just stick with those colors basically. And you use another color on the opposite side of the color wheel as an accent color. In other words, nothing makes green look greener than a little bit of red. Nothing makes orange pop as orange better than a little bit of blue. So it's always good to have a little bit of the complement in there as well. Now the third idea, or I guess this would be the fourth color scheme, and this is my favorite because I think it's the most versatile and it's the most sophisticated, is called a triad. Now a triad just means you cut the color wheel into 3 equal pieces and you use those 3 colors. A very simple triad would be the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. That's not a very sophisticated triad, but it gets you around the entire color wheel, what you do at that point to make it a little more sophisticated is you turn those 3 points just a little bit. So instead of just being a flat blue, yellow, and red, you end up with a blue-violet, a red-orange, and a yellow-green. That is a really interesting color scheme that is much more sophisticated, and it's softened a little bit. And of course, again, you have to decide early on what your dominant temperature will be and your predominant color. In other words, if we're using blue-violet, red-orange, and yellow-green, you can say, okay, most of my painting is going to be red-orange. Maybe it's 80% red-orange, it's 10% blue-violet, and just a little bit, just little accents of yellow-green. And last but not least, a really quick, surefire way to make sure the colors in your painting are harmonious is to make sure that the background colors are in your shadow colors. Look at Rembrandt, look at Gilbert Stuart, John Singer Sargent. They were really masterful at making sure the background colors are in the shadow colors. And you can look at it the other way as well. You can say, make sure your shadow colors are in your background. But those two things intermingled really set up an optical mix in the viewer's eye, in the viewer's brain, so that this spatial relationship is fostered, and it really works well. So there's been a lot of information, you've seen a lot of things, so let's try to see if we can pull it all together and crystallize it and see if we can get this whole idea about understanding color to make sense. The first thing we talked about was the fact that because we are humans in this universe, on our planet, and we have this eye and this brain, all we see is visible light. That's 7 colors of the components, or that make up the components of white light coming from the sun. So to transfer that to the color wheel, that just ends up with 6 colors. And as soon as you decide and you wrap your brain around the idea that you can only see and perceive 6 colors, that will be a breakthrough for you, and you will simplify things greatly by doing that. The second thing that you can think about is using a limited palette. Another thing you can think about is making sure that you have a dominance of color temperature in your painting. Just make sure it's as simple as convincing yourself that this painting needs to be warm or it needs to be cool. Then decide on a color scheme. We talked about 4 color schemes: complementary, split complementary, analogous, and triad. And the last thing we talked about was the fact of making sure that your background colors are in your shadow colors, or you can look at it like your shadow colors need to be in your background.